Let's start with the before lecture chant. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. For today, I chose one of our rather important, I'd say, Chinese ancestors. And those of you who have the book, though, I encourage you to take a look at our Indian ancestors, what we call our first free female ancestors, from the point of view of being able to be ordained and practice. But I chose Chinese ancestor Zongchi because I find the stories about her, or at least the ones I've read so far, to be really interesting and in some significant ways, I think. Firstly, because there really is so little written about her, which is interesting because she holds a very significant place in Zen from its earliest beginnings. And she is also, I think, what we can call, she's an excellent example of what is still true today in Zen, which is that women can train right alongside men. So I want to tell you just a little bit about her life. When she was born, which was 504, her father, Wu, had been emperor only for a really short time. And it was really a time of much unrest and civil war in China. And Zongchi grew up privileged, actually, and was taught kind of strict Confucian principles by both her mother and her father, and also Taoist principles, including a real love of nature. So in her early years, this is what she grew up with, a respect for elders and an emphasis on kindness, especially for those who were not as fortunate as she was. But she mostly, in her early years, grew up behind the walled palace. And she sort of watched passively as life went by. Different lives played out in front of her, many different worlds, with really, as you can imagine, very strict boundaries, prohibiting her to really cross over. And it was a little bit like Siddhartha Gautama walking out into the town and seeing the many ways of life unfolding in front of him for the first time. But for Zongchi, as a daughter of an emperor, she did not cross these lines. But something significant did happen that would reshape her life. After becoming emperor, her father converted from Taoism to Buddhism. And Zongchi experienced the rise of Buddhism in China all around her and within herself as well. And her father often invited monks and nuns and lay persons to come to the palace and have these really great convocations and conversations about Buddhism. And from an early age, Zongchi would make sure that she was within earshot, or she would sometimes just go in and sit down and just listen. And evidently, the women of the court conspired together to make sure that she was able to attend, often hiding her among the throngs of people, both in and outside of the palace walls, actually. And so it was really a result of all this these rich gatherings and conversation, when she would just wander in and around, listening and taking it all in, that this sense of solidity of class difference that she had lived with in her lifetime, for an example, this solidity started to fade away. And the author writes, and I quote her, that then for Zongchi, it was as though all beings were her body, and her body, all beings. By the time she was 19, Zongchi had already long committed herself to the Buddhist path and asked permission from her parents to be ordained. And they both agreed, and she went to a convent. Now, mind you, it was a convent that was built for noble women. So for her, the convent became increasingly and more obviously just totally disconnected from the reality of the world outside the walls. It was really designed for comfort. There were few rules, and those rules that were abided by were very lax. And there was very little discipline and very little study. In fact, Tisdale says that at this time, Zongchi was disillusioned, which is to say, she got rid of her illusions. So she left. And she walked into the city and she just observed life. And she waited. And she had heard stories of an Indian prince who had become a monk and had traveled to China. A monk described as very coarse in manner, gruff, very large in body. And this monk's name, who was making the rounds, was Bodhidharma. Zongchi continued to travel about, and it was at a Buddhist festival that she just happened to decide to attend that she saw and met up with Bodhidharma. Now you might ask yourself if this is something that just serendipitously happened, or maybe it was by design, or maybe it was her karma, or their karma. But he was sitting in a park with 3 other monks, and he was talking, presumably teaching. And she walked over and she sat down with them. He looked up, nodded, and continued talking. And later in that day, she accompanied him and the 3 other monks to a nearby monastery. And there was never, evidently, any discussion of her being a woman among monks. Never a word about her lower status as a woman and how that does not fit either with this small group or with the monastery itself. And this group of monks and Bodhidharma simply made room for her. Evidently, she says that if he had asked her to leave, she would have. But he didn't. It didn't matter to him at all. So this group of 5 people had an itinerant life, but each day they spent long hours sitting in front of a wall, Bodhidharma's famous wall gazing practice. And perhaps it was a wall in a city street, or in a cave, which he's famous for, or in front of a rugged cliff near the ocean's edge. Or it could be a wall of trees, or a wall of people. And one day they even walked to the Great Wall, where they saw thousands of workers and animals toiling away in terrible conditions, great suffering. And they sat and they faced that wall too. And this was such a really important, significant time of realization and maturity for Zongchi. She spoke often of how she had spent her entire life inside the palace, inside the court, inside a world in which she had to be inside a role. She was very aware of her place and her purpose in that life. And now she was outside this very familiar cage of rank and status and even gender. And Bodhidharma said to her, and I quote Tisdale here, to find a Buddha, all you have to do is see your own nature. Your nature is the Buddha. And the Buddha is the person who is free, free of plans, free of cares. And so she became someone who could live her life without boundaries, outside of boundaries. And she no longer thought in terms of high or low or in or out. She no longer thought of, and in her words, the edges of herself and the edges of the world as being different things. You know, a beautiful expression of boundlessness, of vastness, of interconnectedness. I think you'll remember me saying last week that the author, Sally Tisdale, of the book we're reading, sorry, I forgot to mention Women of the Way, that she was intent on telling the stories of the lives of these ancestors, not just what was carried through the centuries as proof of their enlightenment, such as a poem they might have written, or a response to their teacher, or a dialogue during which maybe they show a disbelieving monk what they're really made of. And this story is really quite extraordinary, I think. First is the fact that at a relatively young age, in her early 20s, Zongchi leaves the convent and starts living a wanderer's life. She wholeheartedly embraces this newfound freedom of no boundaries, physical, mental, social. And I must say also that female ancestor stories are often like this. Their commitment to awakening, to following the path, overshadows all else. Their family, their commitments to family, their home, and certainly the danger a woman alone faces out in the world. And it's not unlike us. Maybe we were not home leavers, or perhaps it wasn't dangerous for us to follow the Buddhist path, but we know even today it is for many. Some of you may have faced great challenges in your families. Perhaps there are people who didn't share your interest in and commitment to Buddhism. You know, I know a number of nuns and monks and lay people who have faced precisely this. Difficult road. So although our particular circumstances may not feel as risky or as dangerous as the path Zongchi and many of our ancestors chose, we still likely veered from the norm, all of us, finding our way, possibly with a great deal of uncertainty. And when I feel and I see Zongchi starting her journey away from the convent, what I feel most is trust. Trust in herself and trust in the path that really she was just starting to fully discover. And again, was it not like that for us? Some of you have shared your way-seeking mind journeys with us, and for some there was clearly just a trust in the path, one step after another. I myself have always felt this way. And thinking of this reminded me of how it felt to seek a place to practice. And think of your own wandering, even if it wasn't far from home, or even outside your home. This too is not like the wandering and the searching and the waiting that Zongchi experienced. For me, like many of you, it took years to find a Sangha and a teacher. And once I actually was on the Buddhist path, and then it happened. Just like Zongchi wandering into a city and seeing Bodhidharma sitting in a park under a tree, the very monk who brought Buddhism, Chan, to China. But even if he hadn't accomplished that, he was a well-known figure and considered a great teacher. And of course, our important Zen ancestor. And Zongchi became one of his 4 disciples, the other 3 being men. So she found a Sangha, and she found a teacher, for the moment anyway, like us. And she listened with great heart. And then, along with her teacher and the other disciples, she simply turned and faced the wall, just like all of us did and do today. Do you remember the first time you entered a zendo? Maybe your experience was similar to mine. You know, I had to be told to sit down and face the wall, during our first meditation sit. And I really didn't know why, but it didn't matter to me. But it wasn't long before I understood that I was quite simply facing my own mind, facing my own life. And Zazen really is a very compassionate method for revealing the true nature of our minds. And we've learned that Bodhidharma sat facing the wall for 9 years, famously having removed his eyelids so he wouldn't fall asleep. And he taught that the intimacy of realization is just that, facing the wall, direct practice. So one day, after this small group had been traveling about together, Bodhidharma asked the 4 of them to come round and be with him. And he asked for a summary of what they had learned so far. It's told that he said, "What have I given you?" And one of the monks, Dao Fu, eagerly stepped up and said, "I have come to see that Buddhism is not about words, but we have to discuss it in words." And Bodhidharma replied, "Yes, this is my skin." Another monk, Zongchi is next, stood up and said, Joyfully, I understand that knowing the way is like seeing paradise. Once is enough." And Bodhidharma replied, "Yes, this is my flesh." Dao Yu then took his turn by saying, "The elements truly have no essence, and the aggregates, such as form, feeling, perception, etc., don't even exist. I cannot attain a thing." "Yes, this is the bone," replied Bodhidharma. And finally, Huike, that's Huike, the oldest of them, stepped forward slowly, and then he slowly and deeply bowed, and then slowly stood up and remained silent. Yes, this, is the marrow. And so, Bodhidharma expressed the skin, this flesh, this bone, this marrow, a body that stretches back from him to his teacher, and to his teacher's teacher, and so on back into time. One Buddha body, made up of and needing all of these things. You might say skin, form, flesh, action, bones, heart, marrow, mind. And as Tisdale writes, a whole body. Nothing extra, nothing missing. Zongchi's expression of what she had learned articulated this practice of direct experience, which really cannot be duplicated by trying to describe it, explain it, or even teaching it. And this was essentially an expression of Bodhidharma's wall gazing. Each moment in our lives, he said, is like a wall that we need to face. He encouraged Zongchi and his other disciples to act according to the conditions they encounter, not the conditions they wish could be. In other words, just face the world like you face the wall. After the death of her teacher, Zongchi is said to have continued to wander really quite easily amid really difficult times in China. And she had no desire ever again to live inside. So she wandered. She visited cliffs and caves, but kept walking, and then one day found herself in the shadow of a beautiful granite mountain range. And she decided that in fact, it was time to just stay with this mountain, this particular Buddha, this wall. Eventually, one by one, students arrived. And like her teacher, she made them sit for long periods of time facing walls. Walls of rock and trees and forests and earth, telling them there is only knowing one's nature, only discovering the stillness of being a body inside and outside. When we sit zazen, when we face the wall, we find reality. And sometimes it feels like there's something really solid, right? You can actually feel your back hurting maybe, or if you touch your thigh, you can feel that, and it feels the solid quality of your body. But at the same time, sitting zazen, we can feel that really nothing is ultimately solid. And this is the beauty of zazen. This direct experience is something that comes along when we get up off the cushion and step out into our lives also. And all we do can be an expression of our awakened Buddhist nature. We too are the same flesh as Bodhidharma, one body of awakening. We'll take a moment for reflection.